we planned for a longer timeline to make the game from like start to finish than Crashlands 2 or than original Crashlands, because that was a 2-year game, right? But the fact is, we're probably going to spend about the same amount of time working on each game. Mm-hmm. It's just that the original Crashlands, we had to spend a year working on it after we launched it. Butterscotch. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 381 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the web programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artist.
Hey, this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's September 15th, 2020. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be explicit language on this show. There's not going to be anything implicit about what we're talking
exactly
about.
What we mean.
You know, we really feel that we're strong communicators, and a big part of that is, swearing.
being explicit.
Yeah.
You got to take that filter off, and you got to say what's in the brain pan.
Yep.
Get it out there. Mm-hmm. And it's often curse words.
Yep.
So just know that's coming. We'd just like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your recurring donations to help keep our mics full of diesel. We're looking to make the switch to more green, more renewable microphones. One of the rough parts about a diesel-powered mic is you need to have the generator in a different place.
Yep, a very different place, as far away as possible.
Yeah, and it also sucks to have them indoors, because if you podcast too long, you die. You die of carbon monoxide.
Yeah, I had to get one of those big, those big exhaust pipes that you see really cool people with those really cool trucks who are so cool.
So cool. Love those trucks.
Sort of smokestack pipe. Yeah, I got one of those. To, pipe.
Yeah, so it just goes like, did you punch a hole in the wall so you can vent?
I punched a hole through my wall into my neighbor's house, just so it just goes direct. It seems like that's what's so cool.
Yeah, so through the wall, across the yard, through their wall, into their house.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're like, not in my backyard.
No, absolutely not.
It
looks so cool.
But into your house, for sure. All right, so here's the deal. We got a lot of things happening. We're blazing forward on Crashlands 2, but we don't have anything, hyper specific that we want to talk about as far as development, because just too many things are happening too fast, and it's real fast and loose. So we just want to go into questions this week. We're going to do a question-geddon, question-pocalypse.
Yeah.
Cool?
Yeah.
You guys ready?
I'm so ready.
Yeah.
All right, so these questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net. If you'd like to get your question onto a future episode, you can just go there, ask. You can upvote questions, and we generally try to go, down the list based on upvotes. Most episodes, we only go down one question, though. So this is and that still might be the case this time.
You never know.
We'll see.
It's tricky.
Yeah, you never know. Highest upvoted question comes from Challosis, who says, some parts of making a game are really fun. Some parts are really annoying. Which part of making a game feels exactly in the middle?
Fun and annoying.
I have one.
Go.
Well, it's two, and they're kind of similar, which is optimization and refactoring. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So they're fun because it's always an interesting kind of, logic puzzle to figure out, like, how can I make the same thing happen but better?
Yeah. And you're working on stuff that's already there.
It's already there. Yeah. So it's just like this cool puzzle. You're just like trying to like take this big chunk of redundant code and like turn it into something like fast or find a way to memoize things which is a technique where you take something that was normally being recomputed just every single frame, and you make it so that the computer remembers the last time it was computed, and then it only gets recomputed when you need it.
Yeah.
Like when something changes.
It's also more generally called caching.
Caching, yeah, where you just like you store stuff instead of recompute it.
Yeah, right? I still stand strong that memoize is perhaps the best word for this situation.
Yeah, like one of the things I just did this yesterday. I added memoizing to build mode in Crashlands 2 because we have this big grid where you can put down pieces of buildings and floors and stuff like that. But every single frame, the game was recomputing whether you could put stuff on a certain grid space. And the thing about grid spaces is it's 2-dimensional So it's an area. There's a lot of them. Mm-hmm. Even if you only get like a 10 by 10 grid, that's 100 grid spaces. All of a sudden,
every step.
Right?
Too much.
Yeah.
Areas in video games are the real killer, because everything's an image first, right? So everything's already an area.
Yep.
And then now everything is taking place in an area, and man, that stuff scales fast.
That's a lot. So I updated it so that I rewrote everything so that now it's just like we only ask questions about each grid space when something important changes, that would change the answer. And it's fun because it's kind of like it's a nice puzzle, but it's annoying because it's more fragile, right? Like if you're just recomputing everything every single frame, then you always have everything up to date. You never miss a beat, right? But if you're now trying to make it be kind of like a event-based where you only recompute stuff when you have to, then you need to make sure that you know when you have to recompute and that you don't miss a thing. Because that's when things get janky, right? Where like suddenly you allow the player to do something they weren't supposed to be able to do because you forgot to recompute a valid action or something like that. So
whenever something weird happens, especially on like websites because they do heavy caching. Just every time something weird happens, it's because of something wonky in the cache. Just every time. And they're so hard to debug because then you're like, oh, let me just rerun this, right? But you're just using the cache again, Like where's it coming from? Yeah, it gets really hard to track those things down.
I think on the art side, it's sort of the intersection of the art and design side, but UI stuff for me is basically exactly in that fun and annoying Venn diagram, because it's very fun usually at the start in terms of you have a thing you're trying to do, and so there's like a lot of wireframing. It's very fast, right? Early on, where you get these really dirty prototypes where you're just kind of like running through them with people and seeing if they would work and that sort of thing. And it's both very enjoyable, and then also you get to answer just like a lot of questions about how this might impact X, Y, or Z. And the thing that's annoying about it is that when you go to fully make the thing, one, it requires a lot of precision. Anything that requires a lot of precision is generally very annoying, especially in the art space, because it's your hand doing it. So it's not necessarily the case that you can't just like say, give me exactly that. You got to like use your paw and somehow put the pixels in the correct space, which is very, very frustrating from time to time. But then even more is that at the very end, oftentimes of like 3 days worth of UI work, you'll export like 4 buttons. So it's this weird,
because the hard work is the design of like what all needs to be present and how do you arrange it. I will say though that since we've developed our cake frames technology, pixel precision is no longer an issue, really.
Yeah, everything's pretty light. I would say it's not an issue on the programming side. Because on the art side, you have to, if you're doing like a 9-slice button or stuff like that, if you get 1 pixel wrong,
that'll get you.
Yeah, so you got to be very precise with it, where you can't. There's not as much room for, I guess, just like a little bit of that dithering, a little bit of that jank that doesn't matter. But in the case of UI, it always matters for some reason. I will say our UI pipeline has gotten way easier. So now after my like 2 or 3 days worth of work, talk to Seth, export a few buttons, and then usually it's all in within like a few hours, as opposed to previously it was then another couple of days of Seth putting together stuff and then us being like, shit.
Yeah.
And,
the hard part is where it's supposed to be, which is just the design, right? Yeah. Trying to figure out how to make it a good human experience, because you can automate like the systems to make it so that when you then go to do a thing, it's easier, like gives you automatic precision or whatever, alignment or whatever, right? But you can't automate just doing a good job design something,
Yeah. Now that I think more about this question, I would say every part of making games is really fun and really annoying.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was actually,
because you're talking about design, and I'm like, man, I hate design. But I was like, design is really fun because like you get over like this pie in the sky, like, oh, what do we want this to be? And then you've got to answer the 3,000 door problem questions, which is annoying, But it's like it's fun to think of, try to tackle that. And like answer all those questions and think through all of the implications, but it's kind of annoying that you have to,
Because when I heard this question, I was actually really struggling to have an answer, because I was thinking about this in between like vacuum, right, of stuff that's neither fun nor annoying, right? And that's boring is what that is. That's what that space is,
Which then is annoying to me.
Which then is annoying because it's boring. I think that's exactly it. It's like I can't handle boredom, probably that's an ADHD driven thing, right? Like I cannot do it. And so nothing actually occupies that space because I have to put it into one of the other two spaces, to make it, to have a motivation to actually do something. But of course, putting it in the annoying space, that's also, while still interesting, like it's a spite based motivator, that still can get out of hand, over time as it gets more and more frustrating to try to do something. So what I'm actually always doing with my like approach to problems and like the skill sets that I develop is finding ways to move stuff from the boring and annoying parts of that spectrum over into the interesting and fun part of the spectrum, so that I don't have to do things that I just hate doing.
Yeah, as soon as you have to do something that's boring, you're like, my job is not to do this boring thing. Yep. My job is now to figure out how nobody has to do this boring thing. That's my job now.
I think it's fair, to be honest, because like really it depends on what your scope is when you say like, a part of game dev, right? Because even if you're doing concepts, which I think a lot of artists, early artists in particular, have like the dream job is typically concept art for people, and there's a reason, because the sort of early notion of what that is like, oh, you get to like, it's this pie in the sky, you get to like dream up stuff.
You're not limited by reality.
Yeah, and the actual facts is like, no, you are extremely limited by technical constraints, by what your sound team's capable of, even like what animation engine you use. You have to know all of these things to actually get a really good concept put together, because it's actually not
the concept the concept is supposed to be a representation of what the game is intended to look like and be like. And
that's one of the hardest things to accomplish.
Yeah, if you do a bunch of things in your concept work that are literally impossible, or based on the constraints of the game, or that don't make any mechanical sense, or violate some of like the core pillars of what the game's vision is supposed to be,
or even how the pipeline's going to work, right? And I think this is like, to me, this is what pre-production is. Pre-production is like, is this really interesting period of saying like, okay, yeah, here's where we want to go conceptually with this stuff. We know that the pipeline or the tech we have will take care of like this much of it, roughly. And we know we're purposely, setting a target that's a bit further above our capabilities, right? I think that's perfectly reasonable to do on the concepting side in the early stages, because you're still figuring out what the whole thing's going to be, right? You're establishing those foundational rules. But then later it's like, oh no, there's a set pipeline, there's a set bunch of stuff. And so it's very not like, it's just not pie in the sky.
Well, because why do you make a concept, right? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is like you said, it's the early design phase, and you're basically just sort of framing out like the general visual themes of the game. But then further into production, concept art basically serves to like take the design concept. This is on like a larger team typically, right? It's to take the design concept and convert it into something that can be agreed upon between the designers and the artists, right? And then the modelers or whatever, or the sort of technical artists will take that concept and turn it into an actual thing that goes into the game. And they'll try to adhere to the concept as closely as they can, given the technical constraints, right? And so it very much reminds me of, you guys know, like in Office Space, there was that guy who's like, I go to the customers and I get their specs and then I take it to the engineers, right? Yep. He's like, it's because the customers are bad at talking to the engineers, and the engineers are bad at talking to the customers, and I'm a people person, and I'm the in-between guy, right? Like, to me, that's kind of a concept artist, right? But if you don't have a strong sense of design to talk to the designers, you don't have a strong sense of the technical constraints, then you can't actually do that job well, right? And so it's not just dreaming stuff up. Right?
Yeah, I mean, this is true for there's no field out there that isn't cross-disciplinary in at least some dimensions. There's just nothing out there that isn't. But some can cross some pretty extreme boundaries, right? And I think game dev is one of those where things get so technical, but also so designy, and also so, like they go really far on like all kinds of different fields, right? And if you don't have at least some inkling of like how each of those dimensions works.
I actually want to mention this because so the Thor Ragnarok trailer, or not Thor, the God of War Ragnarok, sorry, you know.
Right.
Wait, okay.
Not the movie, not the Marvel movie.
Not the Marvel movie.
Not Thor.
Not Thor at all.
Video game.
The
God
new,
of War.
Yeah, the God of War sequel. Another trailer for that came out, I think yesterday or something like that. And I watched it, and there's this moment where I just thought, how in the fuck? Because basically there's this. It's like toward the end. They're standing on like this hillside, and there's an eclipse that's happened, right? And it's Kratos, his son, two wolves next to each other. And this, again, like, if you want to see to me, like the most intense blending of, to me, what game dev is, I think God of War as a series is one of the most incredible, because it's like extreme execution on
just every dimension,
every front. And this particular moment had me being like, what, just how in the fuck did this go from actual concept to they did it, which is that the sun shoots an arrow at the moon that's blocking out the sun. Okay. The sun there's words. Atreus.
Yeah.
The boy shoots an arrow at the sun,
which is Sol.
Which is Sol, which is being blocked by a moon. Okay. When he does this, and keep in mind, the sky is like red and all, spooky and weird. When he does this, one of the wolves standing next to him, I shit you not, basically turns into a rocket. Okay. Goes fucking blasting across the sky, chasing the moon as it falls. The sky's ripping in half. Right? I can't even describe this shit. Rips in half.
I'm trying to imagine this, and I can't.
Yeah, you gotta see it, because I was looking at it, because I know also that what happens in this game is that this is a constant shot. The whole game is shot as one sequence. You're not fading in and out of cutscenes.
Are they doing that again?
100%.
Yeah. So this is in engine.
It's in engine, and I just saw this, and I literally, I've been thinking about it. This is like 2 days ago. So I was like, I just don't. Just how? Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
I've
one of
even
those
seen this in lighter ways with like. Did you guys play Control at all?
Oh no, I didn't play it.
It's very. I mean, it's very cool. That was. I think I talked about it when I first played it a few years ago. But it was like the first AAA title that I'd played in quite some time. Big box, hundreds of millions of dollars thrown at it, kind of a thing. And I had that same kind of experience. So it sounds like less so than what God of War is doing, but in that, because that game is all about Control is all about spooky metaphysical realm stuff. It's kind of like Warehouse 13, if you ever saw that sci-fi show where there's like artifacts in the world that are basically magic, and there's a team of people whose job is to go like sequester them and put them somewhere, right? So this is basically like the place where they put those things. And as you move through the game, you have these like moments where you'll come into a room, and the room is like kind of eschery, it's like all the blocks have like come out. It's like, it's just in this really weird state. And it then like reconfigures itself like when you're done doing something, And it was like watching this like room like unfold and like refold, where I was just like, how? It was this thing I do where it was just like, how is this happening? Although I think that for me, Superliminal, which is different kind of thing entirely, but Superliminal, the game, where it's perspective based, like that more than anything I've ever seen. Even these like really epic things like what you're talking about, where I'm like, I have literally no idea how, but I can see like how a person can like come up with, and then like a team of really good people could maybe figure that out. But like looking at Superliminal, that shit is so wild.
This is the game where basically if you pick up an object and then move it into space such that it could be like bigger, as if it were like further away, or smaller. If you like pick up an object that's far and then you sort of look down at the ground while still holding the object, then now the object is tiny.
Yeah.
And likewise, if you look up at a big space and let go of it, then now it's fucking huge and it like crashes down to the ground. And it's like, it's the same thing where you just
use it, and it's just puzzles. It's puzzles based off of like fucking with.
I mean, this was kind of like when Portal first appeared.
Yeah.
Right. Which was actually originally a small student game called Narbacular Drop.
Yeah, did you play that one? I actually played
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, the concept is the same, which was that idea of like you can like create these doorways anywhere, and you can look through one of them and see through it. And if you have them sort of facing each other, then it becomes like this infinite mirror kind of effect, right? Except like you're looking, you're like looking at the back of your own head, right? And then it's just going infinitely. And I mean, those are the kinds of things that just, you take it for granted once you've seen it a few times, right? But at the first time you see it, you're just like, this is nuts. Like,
I mean, there's a reason too where like Portal is the only game that has like there hasn't been another game where like arbitrarily placing portals that you can just like see and then step through was a core part
Is
of
the game. Yeah.
like is the game, right? Well, I think actually a lot of that comes down to one of the I feel like the vibe based on what I hear other game developers talking about, and especially newcomers, is it feels like level design is this kind of weird spot where it's I don't know, it feels like an unsung hero, of the process. Cause like I think that's maybe the hardest job in game dev is taking all of the stuff that is available and like converting that into
An experience.
an experience that is good, and a progression of experiences that satisfy certain criteria using all the tools at your disposal, right? Because like as like Sam's working on the world in Crashlands 2, and Sam and Jenny are like putting the story together and stuff, right? Or as Sam was in particular was working on like Levelhead, right? And it's the blank canvas effect with extreme sort of constraint also on top, right? It's like you just have to know so much, but then in the end, you're still trying to deliver some kind of particular experience while also preventing all kinds of other experiences from happening. Like it's
pretty hard.
Yeah. Well, I think there's this line from there's this Miyazaki documentary, the guy who did all those great animated movies, so Ponyo and a bunch of other stuff. Spirited Away, and he's hilarious because he's like chain smoking just like the whole time, and he's kind of angsty, but he makes these like he directs these incredible, like very lighthearted, wholesome films. And he just says at one point, they're like, how's this going? He's like, it's such a hassle. All of this is a hassle. Like that's the word he uses to describe this incredible stuff that he does, right? It's just a hassle. And yeah, he's just chain smoking, and he's like, oh, it's fucking hassle. And it's hilarious because it's true. I mean, yeah, I think all of it's fun and annoying all at the same time, depending on where you bound the piece that you're talking about. Yeah, it's just like the 3 hours you spend drawing, that can be pretty fun, Is it then slicing up that drawing and putting it into spines so you can animate? Not particularly fun.
Bit of a hassle.
But then you get to go animate it, which is like
it's pretty
also
fun.
a hassle, but then you get to see the thing come into life, which is fun, Like,
but then you put it in the game and then like some of it doesn't quite work the way you thought. And it's pretty
hassle
annoying. Hassle game.
Yep.
Yeah. All sorts of stuff. It's just constant.
It's just hassles all the way down.
It really is.
All right, next question comes from Rayboblio, who says, "Hi, you guys are just the awesomest to listen to."
Oh, thanks.
Appreciate
So
that.
sweet.
Thanks for a great pod. So to my question, in episode 98, which was
Shit.
Years ago.
6 years ago.
it was a while ago.
5 years ago?
In episode 98, you were talking about the demon robot armies you were spawning to do your bidding, like upload podcasts to YouTube, etc. Sure, it was some time ago, but I'm assuming you are still robomancing away. What tech or programming language are you using for your robomancing needs?
This is an Adam thing, for sure.
Adam's our robomancer still.
Yeah, it's still kind of my wheelhouse, but I've been trying to make things more accessible to the team as a whole for automating things, right? So in my earlier days, I would always basically like everybody needs to learn how to become at least to some extent a programmer, get some like basic programming skills in, because with a little bit of knowledge now, so you get to start just automating and raising armies, right? But everyone's got shit to do, right? Everyone's got things they need doing, and they just don't.
And very
have
often,
the
a little
time.
bit of knowledge isn't quite enough
to do anything.
to automate something
it really
well.
isn't. Yeah. And I mean, the reality is, like, because I started in programming to automate my work. Like that was like the motivating factor, And I was able to automate little bits and pieces very early on, but that's because like I was doing science stuff, and so I needed to crunch numbers, and like numbers, that's a straightforward thing, right? Almost anything else you want to do, that's like a year of programming under your belt first, So I've been trying to lean more into tools like Google Sheets with like AppScript, and then Make.com, which formerly Integromat. So if anybody's ever used like a service like Zapier, there's a handful of them, but it's basically about sticking one web service to another web service and letting somebody else deal with the details of how to make that work. And like Integromat is, I think, the best example out there in terms of what it lets you do, how much you can kind of like automate things and so on. So I've been trying to kind of push the team towards that kind of stuff, which has been good for the team because we've been seeing kind of more and more things sort of pop up, making use of pre-existing kinds of tools
Solutions,
designed for this purpose, right? Like general purpose automation systems. So I would highly recommend for anybody with a team, and this is whether or not you already know how to program, because presumably you're trying to program some other stuff for some reason, right?
Yeah.
And so if you can avoid like building out entire custom tools, because they have to worry about deployment and like version management and like all kinds of stuff. If you can avoid that, then that's ideal. as long as your needs can be met by the stuff you're trying to do. And the stuff that's out there really can meet just a fuckload
Do a lot
of the stuff that you need to do. So highly recommend make.com, which on the one hand, I'm very impressed that they managed to buy that domain. But on the other hand, worst fucking name choice. Ungoogleable.
You gotta Google make.
Yeah. Look, you're not, it's not terrible choice. But it's very cool. Zapier, I don't think scales well, and I think the user experience is bad, but it is more user friendly for the very early aspect. Like someone brand new to trying to think about automating stuff might do better there, but it doesn't scale well practically or from a cost perspective. And then Google App Script is another great one where you can actually add scripting sort of piecemeal over time into things like Google Docs and Google Sheets and stuff. So that's where I'm trying to have like kind of the team push things. And then otherwise for my own stuff, I'm still using what I have been for the past few years. I don't want to go into the weeds on it, but the core idea is that I'm trying to stay within as like narrow of a language scope as I can. Mm-hmm. So for any given programming language, you can write stuff on a subset of systems, like maybe this only works on Mac, maybe this only works on whatever, maybe, that kind of thing. So a long time ago, I decided to go into the JavaScript stack because you have things like Node or Dino and these other things that let you run JavaScript outside of the browser, because normally that's the only place that it lives. But also, I need to do stuff in the browser so then I can stay in the same language. Mm-hmm. So you can do web stuff and non-web stuff. Exactly. So that's like having to learn a whole new language. Right. Yeah. So I try to kind of stay in that space, and in that way I can stay in the kind of the web technology space, but still make things that can work on just anything on any machine. So all of our tools are still built that way. And then otherwise just using automations attached to like our GitHub and like where all the code is actually stored and stuff. Yeah, so. GitHub, just all the different web hooks and automations they have in there. Yeah. Pretty good way to robomance. And we've actually moved a ton of stuff over to that. So our entire game pipe, which we basically Seth can say, hey, the game is now in a state where I want to version it and deploy it so that QA can do tests and stuff, right? And so he just has to run a command to do that. And then a whole bunch of things cascade from there, but it all basically starts with the code lands back in GitHub where it's all stored and then triggers a whole bunch of automations that are run from there to like spawn a Windows machine, spawn a Mac machine, and like have them build the game and then have the Windows machine create a VM, a virtual machine for Android and like make a build for that and so on and so forth, right? And we've moved as much stuff as we can kind of into that space because then all of the code and then the code that manages the code, right? Like all of it is in the same place, which over time, what I found is that as we make like lots and lots of tools and like have lots of little projects here and there, it just starts to get so spread out and diffuse that maintaining and managing that just turns into a complete nightmare.
The bigger the army gets, the more you need some good organizational controls or good organizational schemas to keep it actually functioning.
Yep. It gets very hard to manage.
This is why, battles and wars are won and lost on logistics. Mm-hmm. You may have an army of 1 million people, but if you march them somewhere and then you can't, like, how do you feed them? How do you keep them housed and sheltered and healthy? It's like, well, if you can't do that, then it doesn't matter unless you've got 1 million people because you can't go anywhere with them. Right.
So I think that's the core idea of the entire tools, like logic, right? Is that it doesn't matter if your company or your team or
matter
whatever,
what has
this cool thing
if you can't use it.
Yeah. So and that's kind of the limitation that we've hit with all the stuff that like I've been doing is it's all command line, as in like you open up a terminal and it's just text and you just type in like a computer hacker, right? Like everything's kind of limited to that space because it's just so much faster and easier to develop there. And so we are moving into like, let's try to put some GUIs on, put some UIs on stuff, that we make. But again, it can all stay within web tech. So then that's the advantage of having the stack where I'm just using one-ish language for every component.
Yeah. So JavaScript for the most part.
Yeah, JavaScript-y stuff.
Yeah.
And then again,
Integromat and Make.
yeah.
Or no, I guess those are the same thing. Yeah. Make and Zapier.
Yeah. But I highly recommend trying out make.com. Like it's the only reasonably priced, but also like you have a lot of control service that I've found so far. So you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. So definitely check that out.
Worth checking out.
Yep.
Our next question comes from Gibbs, who says, what surprised you the most about running your own video game company? Was anything easier than you expected? What was harder?
What was the most surprising?
I'd say the surprising thing was that it was way easier to make video games than I thought it would be. It's not to say that it is easy, but
I see where you're going.
It seemed like a kind of impervious, like
Right. Like it seems literally
how does it?
impossible.
Yeah, like how does this thing come together? You know, it's like Sam was talking about seeing this thing in God of War, and you're like, what?
What in the fuck? How does that happen? Yeah.
But the fact is, like, you know, some people took some time and figured out how to do that, but they know that now, right? And they also could have just not done that. They could have done something else, and it maybe wouldn't have been as spectacular.
Yeah,
but you know,
right. The key is that you have choices that you get to make because you're like in game dev. Your choice isn't like do this thing that seems impossible, or now you can't make a game. Right? It's do that thing if you can figure it out, or come up with something else instead. Like that's the actual path. And so it actually provides lots of leeway as long as you have a lot of control over what the game is going to be.
Yeah. And I think the hard thing is just like we were talking about in the previous question is just the logistics, right? Which is, you know, we now have 6 games out and we're working on the 7th, and those games are in maintenance mode, where we got to keep them running. We keep them, keep them up to date on the different platforms and stuff. But maintaining that many games on that many platforms can be a real problem, right? And then there's the logistics of just development. Like how do you coordinate with a localization team to get 10 languages into your game? How do you communicate with like business partners and platforms to try to get distribution deals for your game? Having the game and making the game, those are not that tough.
Well, I would say they're more straightforward, I guess is right.
Yeah.
Better word, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like
It's not that it's easy, but it's straightforward.
But you don't have to coordinate so many external factors outside of your control to develop your game. But to make it commercially marketable and able to be localized and distributed and to like have it QA tested and all that stuff. It just takes a ton of tooling and communication and tech and logistics and planning and systems, I
think this is also where you get the intense Dunning-Kruger of people who love games but have never even come near the making of games part, where if your only exposure to games is playing them and see how cool all the shit is that people have figured out on the other side of them having figured it out, right? Then it becomes very easy to think, oh yeah, like that must be easy. Like that must be straightforward, right? And it's like your mental model of like what it means to make these things. And then also as you start for the first time, like when you first try to do anything, you're like, oh shit. Like you discover, like I can't, and that's where like we were at the beginning, right? Of like, we don't even have the slightest idea because like all of a sudden we realized all the things we didn't really know were questions, like the door problem we talked about last week and stuff, right? Like suddenly now you do have to solve it. And that's when you see that, oh shit, how does this happen ever? How does anybody ever successfully make a game? It seems literally impossible. And then as you solve more of those problems and discover that you are, as a person, are just capable of figuring lots of stuff out, then even if you don't know how a thing would work, you can kind of imagine that you could figure it out. And now it's
imagine the path to knowing.
Right. Yeah. And then you kind of like keep on inching along there, but then you're still caught in a trap where if you haven't had to release a game into production, and in particular into an audience of a large number of people across different platforms and hardware configurations and so on, right? Then because that part on the other side of that is like a million details, like Seth was talking about, right? It's like just a million things that'll have to be true, and the amount of stability that you need, the mechanisms you need to deal with customer support, like all this kind of stuff, right, is the other part that you don't know about until you get there. And we didn't even think about that until we had to do it, with the launch of Crashlands, right?
Those things have an illusory nature to them. So I'm thinking about the story of Stardew Valley, right, which is a dude really loved Harvest Moon, and he worked solo for 5 years, working odd jobs and supported by his girlfriend, and just putting as much time as he could into making this game. And he didn't, all the stuff we're talking about, he didn't have a distribution pipeline. He didn't have a QA team. He didn't have a localization team. He didn't have any of those things, right? And his game succeeded. It did really well. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that he just never had to bother with those things? No, he had to do it in an emergency way after the fact, right? Because once your game is out, and then you do have people banging down your door who want your game in Portuguese, and you've got bug reports coming in from players, but through all these weird mechanisms like Twitter and stuff like that, and you by yourself are trying to field you're still doing all the work, but you're just doing it at 200 miles per hour now while your tires are on fire, right? Yep. So we think about it as there are things that need to happen, and they're going to either happen in a planned way, during
carefully and slowly,
and within the speed limit.
Yep.
Right. Or, you're going to skip those things. You're going to launch your game. And if it lands, then everything's on fire for a while.
Yeah. And of course, if it doesn't land, then you're fine. Then
that's great.
Nothing to do.
Yeah, and that's also a calculated risk, because you can say if the game wasn't gonna, do well just at its core, then it would have been a waste of time for me to also localize and, do all these other things, because if it doesn't even land with my own primary market in my own country, et cetera, then who's gonna play it otherwise, right? And that's a fair thing that's a fair approach. But if it does land, then you're going to have a bad time for a while, which we found out with Crashlands, because we did work on Crashlands for a whole nother year after launching it, not just in terms of content updates, but just bug fixes. It was 300 hours just to get controller support into the game. Now we have controller support as a baseline continuous core part of our development process. Right. It's just always a consideration for everything that we do. So we're it's still going to take hundreds of hours of work over the, entire lifetime of the game to make sure that controllers work potentially. It'll be less than that, because we've solved most of the problems. But the fact is,
it's in a built-in, because that's what makes it native, right? And also that's what makes it battle tested, because the controller scheme has now been in there since day one, which means it's been developed against and tested since day one. It's had opportunities to see issues. Everything's designed with it in mind, and all the way through, versus original Crashlands, where we just had to say, given the game that we have,
how do we shove
controller support in there? And that's both from a design perspective for the experience part, but then also for the entirety of how the code works.
Yeah, and we didn't have stuff in the original Crashlands, the ability to go into the settings page and change the aspect ratio, stuff like that. There were all these things that we just didn't have. We didn't have any languages either. We got Chinese added later, and that was all we were able to do because the game wasn't set up for that, right?
Yeah, it was a huge ordeal to get it.
It was huge. It took hundreds of hours to get that language in there. And so it's weird, because now we're working on Crashlands 2, and it feels like in some ways we're developing the game slower because we have a longer timeline. We planned for a longer timeline to make the game from start to finish than Crashlands 2, or than original Crashlands, because that was a 2-year game, right? Mm-hmm. But the fact is, we're probably going to spend about the same amount of time working on each game. Mm-hmm. It's just that the original Crashlands, we had to spend a year working on it after we launched it because we skipped too many steps, but we had to, because we didn't have any money left.
I think on the kind of easy, hard question, for me, it relates, I think, to duration of a project.
Yeah.
Because the reality is and very few people actually in their lives work on something that takes 2 fucking years to finish and are working on it the whole time.
Yeah. Or 3 or 4.
Yeah, like you might jump, like a lot of people jump jobs, you know, in the middle of projects and stuff like that. But like, yeah, working on a thing for 2+ years is one of those things that I think I always imagined would be extremely, extremely difficult. But I've actually found to be far easier than that, especially as we've gotten all of our tools and stuff, and things are basically the development is easier and more fun now. It's just easier to work on these things in like a long form capacity. But I think the flip side hard thing about that is basically to me the confidence game, which is like the longer you work on something, at least for me, the more unease I start to feel about my ability to actually rate it, to assess it, because you've been just hanging out with it. Like even this idea of, we've had controller support from day one, right? Is it good anymore? Because like it sort of grew out of something, from a while ago. And so you're not coming at it fresh necessarily. It's like it's just been there and you already know how to play the game with this particular control schema, right? So your ability to assess those things starts going down in a way that I think can make you, as the project goes on, divorced from the reality of the quality of the game in a more negative way. Like the longer, at least for me, like the longer typically I work on something, if we don't do some play tests or get some other random people seeing the game in some capacity, then the more likely I am to start just slowly feeling like,
is this a piece of shit?
Is this a piece of shit? Like, are we
Well,
just
I
working
think
on a
that's
piece of shit?
good. That's actually, I think, a better state to be in than what seems to be the more typical one, which is to, over time, be actually more bought into.
Confidence.
Yeah, more bought into, and an increase in confidence with time because you're like perfecting every little thing, you're like focusing on every little detail, like, and you have this thing that you imagine has become some kind of a reality, and you've like planned around all these kind of experiences that people are supposed to have when they play it, right? And so, because the other side of this that you see is the classic like indie title launches, gets critique, and the developer just like cannot handle that, right? And it turns into some kind of a fight, turns into something like really dramatic,
a weird public thing, basically.
Yeah, and we're often, and the reality is like you get unfair criticism all the time once a thing hits the world, right? Mm-hmm. But you also do get fair criticism, and if you can't see it because you're so confident because you have what you think that you intended to have, right?
Yeah,
because you're so close to it that you can't, like Sam, what you're talking about, like you can't see it because you're worried that you can't see it. But the thing is, you're correct. That's right. You can't tell because you're too close to it, and you do need that outside stuff. So I think that's a good, as much as like you don't want the anxiety that comes with it. I think it's a good.
Yeah, I think that's I think it is a useful. It's a useful approach, but also it's a heavier approach. I think as the project goes on, and even as you in this case with Crash Lands 2, we set some really big goals with it as far as just kind of everything about it, going from the original to the second one, as far as the world design, the kind of like more of an ecology based world where things are happening and you're kind of like dealing with that fact. Your creatures interact with each other, bigger stories, a better build mode, roofs, for fuck's sake, like all these things, right? And so I think the thing it starts, the first part of the anxiety is like, can you even build it? Can you, like, geez, can you figure this out? And then once you cross that one, then you start getting into, I think, the weirder one toward I think kind of where we're at and onward now, which is like, okay, we're building it. We're definitely building toward the target. And then it's
but
like,
are we wrong?
But are we wrong? Yeah. Did we build the wrong thing? And I think that's always, it's a thing I never thought about before because we were so consumed with just being able to build stuff. Does it make sense? And I feel like we've moved definitely in the last, I'd say like probably middle of level head and then kind of onward from there into this more of a pretty confident whenever we set our sights on building something, we can build it. And so it's much less about that and more about the anxiety around like,
which is such a worse position to be in,
Terrible.
Like, when you can only build one thing, life is so simple. You build that thing and if it worked, great. And if not, well, dang it. That wasn't your fault because that was all you could do. So once you can do all kinds of things, then yeah, it's your fault. If you 100%, you just made a bad call. Yeah, that's
it for me.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So as a final note, it's like, is there anything else that's easier than you expected?
Besides,
we talked about things that are hard.
Oh no, I mean that's what I was saying. Is like I think the easier thing is, weirdly enough, is working on a project for a very long time. I found to be it's just very enjoyable now, especially because even, the original Crashlands, we like got really tired like halfway through and just made a bunch of games. Flop Rocket.
Yeah.
Just like
well, we were also broke as fuck, but
we were broke as fuck.
But one thing I was thinking about though too, is that I always felt earlier in our career that the easy part of making a game was at the beginning, and the hard part was the slog of just like the mid to later point of production.
It. Yep.
I feel totally opposite now, because now like we're making larger games, which is what we do now. Like we make, games that have much bigger systems and stuff. It's so hard at the beginning because you don't have anything. And I find it far easier to design when I'm iterating on something that exists. Right. And
I also find editing way easier than creating.
Yeah. And I can't simulate all these systems in my head and answer like, what should our buff debuff system look like? Or like, how should armor work? I have no idea. And so, but once the game starts to settle, then doing more work on it becomes easier over time. So.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you had a much harder time at the start of Crashlands 2 dev. I think because of that particular tendency, right? It's easier to iterate than not, and you just don't have the systems yet to be able to.
Well, and I think, and I don't know if this is an ADHD thing or if this is more of a universal thing, but when you're talking about the idea of like baking in stuff like controller support, across the course of the game. One of the things that really makes it difficult for me to work on a game is having a lot of sort of unfinished threads just kind of hanging loose. And it's far easier to have no controller support at all, and then to just only work on controller support. Mm-hmm. Because like if you're only working on controller support, then that other parts of the game aren't, changing and deteriorating while you're working on controller support. And you can put all your focus into making the controller support good, right? Mm-hmm. But if controller support is just something that's passively exists throughout the game, right, then it adds more consideration to everything that you do. Mm-hmm. And if you don't consider it, then you'll end up with these kind of like, these like unfinished parts of the UIs just kind of sprinkled throughout, where like it mostly works with a controller, but it's not that good, right? And then every time you play it, you got to kind of deal with that. And so I found that, to me, that's actually been one of the harder parts of making a game of this size with all these considerations kind of baked in throughout. Is we have this big vision of all the different things that we need, but they're not all totally there yet. But there's a lot of them are mostly in, but not completely.
Yeah.
And they can't be until they're all in, because they all interact with each other anyway. You can't have full controller support for systems that don't even yet exist, like at some point.
Yeah. Or for UIs that are placeholder UIs just to like get some stuff on screen. Yeah. So it's all kind of a hassle. Like
it's a big hassle. Big hassle.
Is a short way to put it. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.